Hey Derek, I cannot hear you. I don't know if that's me.
I was muted. Let's
Oh,
try
there you
again. Classic.
go.
That's one thing you can consistently count on us for here at ETH Denver and Sporkdow is having technical difficulties and rugging you in the middle of things. It happens every community call.
This is
I'm.
how you know it's not AI.
Yeah.
That's how you know because we
That's
actually mess up. Yeah, I was seeing like Instagram reels already starting to joke about like students using Chat GPT to write their essays. So
So,
I'm
but
just trying to
I
do
saw
those
an
things.
essay that was written by ChatGPT already. I was like,
Yeah, and it's not
it wasn't like,
plagiarized, so it's
yeah, I
much
don't
harder
know.
to catch.
I just gave my students an assignment and said, "This is extra credit. Talk about the subject with the Chat GPT, and then reflect on how well you think it did."
Wow.
That's a cool assignment.
Yeah, it's a wild time to be alive, for sure. Absolutely. So I'll set the table a little bit. I am Derek, the community steward at ETH Denver and SporkDAO, and I am joined today by Rodolfo Ergueta, one of the LPs at Bufficorn Ventures, which we launched just earlier this year, and a special guest, Andrew Penland. And rather than completely fumble it, Andrew, could I ask you to help me introduce you?
Sure. So a lot of people will know me better as Octopus. I use that name in cryptocurrency for the last several years. I am an educational advisor at TE Academy. I've worked with Token Engineering Commons. I'm a member of the Token Gnomes group, and I'm working currently as a consultant with Blockscience Labs on mathematics and strategy.
Yeah.
That's you're a multi hyphenate.
Yeah, I'm like, where did I meet him? And I'm like, well, it's potentially 20 groups that I've seen Andrew in. That's probably where I met Andrew. Can
Yeah.
trace it back. Yeah, and what's interesting about Block Science Labs is that really they're a data science company that is helping Web3 teams design and build and model, pardon me, their token economies, right? And along that product, there is a consulting service, right? Consulting arm that actually gets into the very specific details of how to go about even reasoning about that to actually implementing a model, right? Like a digital twin of sorts of your economy. So yeah, that's the context Andrew and I met in, and are working together on some stuff.
Okay, so let's start all the way at the beginning, and you can correct me if I'm setting the table incorrectly here, because I want to make sure I understand like the scope of where we are and where we're trying, maybe able to get as we wander. So this is in the context of founders who are working on projects and asking themselves questions like, how do I scale? What's my business plan? What's my model of what's going to happen next as I try X, Y, and Z? And how can they sort of like iterate and interact with the real world and their users to see whether or not their plan is happening according to their intentions? So can you help me like maybe create some terms or like some umbrellas or categories that help us say like, yeah, in the conversation about blank, we could zoom into like X, Y, and Z. That could help us start to have a sense of like where we are and what kind of conversation we're having and for who.
Sure, I can go, or Andrew, you go ahead if you want.
So my background is I have a PhD in math, and people always go but I'm on the like side of wanting to make math understandable and interactive. And I think that for a lot of people who are have really good ideas in cryptocurrency, this is exactly the step that they have trouble with. They don't have the math. They may even have programming ability, but they don't really have the math to translate from like their assumptions to what that would tell them. So the big thing that we're wanting to emphasize is we can it's first of all it's really important to build models of how you're thinking and then translate that into things you can actually play with and see if your assumptions how your assumptions bear out under these different models. And I'm pro math. That's my
I like that. That should be a T-shirt. Yeah, and if I can add to that, I think the one of the things that is, as you start a project and you start making a lot of assumptions, right, about how your project's going to work, the incentive systems, the mechanics of how rewards are going to work, and so on and so forth. You have all these like mental models and assumptions, and you can reason maybe like 2 or 3 steps ahead, right? But when you start thinking about, well, what's going to happen, right, if I put, let's say, my emissions rate at X%, right? It may be great in the next year, but what happens in the long term, right? Does that create whales? And this is a very simple example, right? Just to get the point across. But the idea is that the choices that you make right early on have compounding effects and consequences down the line, and many of them may actually be unintended consequences that work against what you're trying to accomplish, right? So the human mind cannot reason like 200, 1,000 steps ahead, and that's when the modeling component comes into play around, well, how if we've taken those assumptions, reasoned about them, formalized them in math specifications, and modeled them out, then that can be a better way to even think about the project itself, right? It's part of the thinking process. We think it helps you get deeper into your own project. So I don't know if that helps set the context a little bit, but a lot of the work that I'm really interested in, that Andrew's amazing at, that Blockscience Labs does, is around that concept of how do you take these perhaps assumptions and really good ideas and battle test them for for long-term sustainability of the project.
Okay, so I'm hearing like a before, during, and after like iterative cycle of having a model or a guess of what you think will happen. For example, in the context of token emissions, if I release this many a year and have these kinds of incentives, I predict I'll see these kinds of like actors and stakeholders enter and have this kind of behavior, and then you would test that out for a couple, weeks, months, whatever your timeline is, and then check it out. Okay, well, what happened? And did my assumptions like reasonably accurately predict? Can you think of any more specific examples of where like places you could go wrong if you're unintentional about your emissions, or like trends you're seeing that you think are a result of poor planning or a lack of understanding, like some of the ways the game theory is currently playing out?
Well, it's really difficult to reverse a decision. You can't unmake a decision. So, not specifically with respect to emissions, but we've seen a lot of projects this year where the collapse was foreseeable in some sense, either because the tokenomics led to obvious hyperinflation potential, or because there just wasn't, the mechanics weren't there. And one thing that I don't like to talk badly about specific people, but we'll talk about ideas. One thing that's kind of interesting is you can tell a lot, I think, by discussing ideas with people, and that's really what the purpose of the math is to help you see, okay, you have this idea. If you carry it to its logical conclusion, what happens? So you can see this really well with the Kelly criterion, which is a guideline for betting that we can talk about. And there was this unearthed tweet from Samuel Bankman-Fried where he says, I disagree with the Kelly criterion, and here's why. And his logic from where he starts is really correct. He's like, the objective function is wrong. Well, if you're doing a different objective function, then yeah, you don't end up with the Kelly criterion. But I think that he was far more, his thinking in that discussion showed a lot about his thinking that might be playing out now in terms of current events.
And maybe can you expand on the Kelly criterion just for
Could I give the like layman's version, and you could maybe elaborate on it, Andrew?
Sure.
My understanding of the Kelly criterion is that it simply means don't make a bet where there's an outcome where you get blown out and you just are completely eliminated and can't ever play again. Like even if the expected value is pretty good or maybe even optimal, if you were able to do it 1,000,000 times, the fact that we live in a world where sometimes one outcome can ruin you forever means that even if the expected value is good, you just shouldn't make that bet according to the Kelly criterion.
Yeah, and you can't get rich if you go broke. And it's really easy to want to get rich. So let's just like it's based on this really simple game where you have a known probability of winning, but you have to pick a strategy of what proportion or fraction of your holdings you will invest on each turn. And you're stuck with that. You can say, okay, I'm going to invest 10% each turn. I'm going to invest 90% each turn, but you're picking that number based on the probability. And if you win, then your holdings are matched. So it's basically double or nothing. And you're going to play for a long time, but you don't know how long. And so the goal is to have as much money as you can at the end of the game. These are the rules. It's a really simple coin flipping game where you bet and then you get back your stake if you doubled if you win, but the coin could be biased and you know exactly the bias of the coin. And so you seem to have a good understanding of it. I'm not trying to rug pull you, but I'm curious. If you looked at just the basic fair coin, probability of winning is 0.5, double or nothing. Rodolfo, you can play too. How much would you invest?
I would invest none.
Well, you,
I would
Let's
invest
model it out.
0% of my portfolio. How many times am I going to play the game? Just one iteration?
you don't know, but it's going to be a large number. So it's like you'll keep going until we yell stop.
Okay. And I do know that the probability is 0.5.
Yes, you know the probability is 0.5, and so you're going to bet 0, and so you have the most like boring trip to Las Vegas ever. Your bankroll just stays exactly the same.
Yeah, I don't go to Vegas.
Okay, well,
and I
see, this is the
I
kind of
never live in a world where I have less than one.
So this is the kind of conversation you want to have with people, because some people are like, yeah, bet it all. We could double the money. But I mean, even if you bet a very small amount, what you tend to see is just kind of you gradually bleed away. So these are some different simulations. Here we got lucky. And you might think, oh, well, maybe that'll happen again. So this is why you need to do it a large number of times and see that you're losing money long term, especially if I'm increasing the number of turns here to 10,000. And then you may see some big spikes, but you keep seeing that in the aggregate, most of these trials are going to end up losing money in the long term. So
in the
it's not
0.5 situation, they lose money in the long term.
Mhm.
What's the asymmetry here? Why isn't it you stay even in the long term?
The asymmetry is that when you start losing, then you have less to bet. So let me think about this, because this is a good question. In a sense, long-term losing hurts more than winning helps, right? Because you can go broke. So even though you hit these wins, you're betting the same percentage. So when you're betting half of a large number, if you lose it, it still hurts a lot, right? Like even if you get up to 1.5 and you're betting a small number, you lose several in a row, it hurts a lot. It takes you back down quickly. So it's the long-term nature of it that creates the asymmetry.
Yeah.
And the fact that like losing hurts more than winning helps if your goal is long-term success.
Right. And there's a finite distance between 0 and 100% of what you start with. And there's an infinite distance between 100% of what you start with and infinity. So like that's another asymmetry here. Like there's like a floor on one side and then there's no ceiling on the other side.
Yeah. So if you hit 0, you're done.
Like, because I thought it was going to be like a random walk. You know what I mean?
If you hit 2, you can still lose money. But if you hit 0, you can't come back.
Right. And that's what we see in the long run.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Are you going to keep on sharing? Andrew?
Are there more examples of Kelly criterion today?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I was having fun.
Okay, cool. Well, let's do it then.
I'll let Rod lead the next one.
Yeah, let me share this.
I'm cheating because I know the answer.
Oh, you've been through that? Okay, I'll be our guinea pig then. I'm having a lot of fun with that.
So we could change some of the numbers. But we could also change the benefit. So what if you're not doing double or nothing anymore? Now you're only going to get like 1.5% of your 1.5 times your investment back, because it makes sense that we're going to adjust the benefit or the bonus based on the probability.
Okay. Let's see, I love this. Let's do it intuitively first. So I win 3/4 of the time, and when I win, I get 1.5x what I bet. And when I lose all of what I bet.
Right.
Okay, so what's the asymmetry there? Like a 2-to-1. And then the rate at which I'm winning is a 3-to-1. So I would want to go as close to all of my money as I can without getting blown out in like this is where the criteria becomes relevant. So like naively I would say all of it, but I want a number close to all of it. Assuming I'm playing it like 10,000 times. Let's try like 75% or 90% of it.
All right, let's try it.
Yeah, somewhere between half and all.
Okay, somewhere between half and all. So you said 0.7?
Sure.
All right, so probability of winning is 0.75.
Oh, we can see your screen, by the way.
I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, here, I'll take care of that.
You see it now?
Mm-hmm.
All right, so I'm just changing the numbers real quick. Let's play the game.
I didn't do great.
Oh, no, that didn't work out.
Okay. My strategy definitely fails consistently, even over 100 turns. Oh, wow. So if I'm only betting, maybe I was way wrong. Can we change it to like 0.25 of my stack? Still a very, very big chunk each.
Well, you got a nice adrenaline rush here, though. Like
Yeah.
Yeah.
You change it to 0.25.
That's like the.
That looks better. So,
whoa, I was doing great for a while.
Yeah.
Look at that 12.
Okay,
Whoa,
I'm right.
60.
Yeah, 60.
Okay, and then if you change it to 10,000.
Okay.
Do I?
Whoa.
Okay, so if I don't
Retiring
get
point.
blown out, eventually I do go.
Well, in this scenario,
I go unicorn. No, I mean if you keep like look at these exponents, I consistently go unicorn with this strategy.
Yeah. So it was much better to do a more conservative number if you run it back.
Yeah.
0.6.
Oh, this would be I spike still. I will usually spike somewhere in the first 1 to 300 turns.
So you have a couple of fun months or years if you play more aggressively, but long term.
Not even as fun. I mean, the aggressive peaks are also lower by many orders of magnitude.
Yeah, but just think about the APY that you could put on your website. Like the first half of the year.
Okay. Very unexpected result. And not even the optimal one. I'm just in the neighborhood of a decent strategy.
Yeah, so this is actually the optimal one. And it was found by John L. Kelly Jr., who was worked for AT&T Labs. This came right after Claude Shannon was discussing information theory. And he took the results that Shannon had about how to transmit symbols over a noisy channel, and he said, what if you interpreted that noise as the probability that you win? And so basically took the results about information theory and turned it into I was not sharing the screen I meant to be sharing. Okay, so back to the math. Here is the optimal result. You can calculate the optimal result as the probability minus numerator 1 minus probability over the benefit. So let's think about that for what we had before. You take 0.75 minus 1 minus 0.75 over 0.5. And if my math is right, that should be 0.5. This is actually the scenario where you should bet exactly half of it. But people want to get way more aggressive. They want to bet 80 or 90% because the numbers look right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think that this is a really awesome example of it's a fun game to think about how much would I bet, right? What would the end goal be after 100, after 10,000 iterations, right? And if you think about this, it's a very simple type of game that we're playing here, right? And when you think about the token economics of projects that are trying to have multiple agents, each agent having multiple strategies, different utility functions, so on and so forth, you can see how this simple example, it had been many unexpected results, right?
Mm-hmm.
So go ahead, Andrew.
I messed up the calculation in my head. You should be way more conservative. Did the math too quickly. This is why I use pencil and paper and computers when I'm doing this for you.
Did I say 0.25 or did you guide me toward
You
that?
suggested 0.25 after the
After
first
my
strategy.
0.7? Oh,
Yeah.
so I happened upon the optimal number.
You did.
Yes.
That's kind of fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I should be a
But
gambler.
That's way.
Vegas, here you go. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, all right, let's kind of get to the punchline. You can also look at other people who have looked at the same problem, and Sam Bankman-Fried says he looks at a similar problem. And,
Oh, we can't see that screen. Sorry.
oh, let me change that.
Oh yeah. After you set it up, I might end up clipping this. I'll ask you to take a pass from the beginning and introing it.
Okay. All right. So Sam Bankman-Fried examined this game back at the end of 2020 and said, "What's your utility function?" So, how cool would it be to make $10,000? How cool would it be to make $1 million? And he argues against the Kelly criterion, but the reason is that his utility function is different. He explicitly says, "My utility function is the same, so I'm going to come up with a different strategy." Well, if you start out with a different utility function, you end up with a different strategy. And that's the part that the math can't actually do, right? If you tell me what you want, I can tell you the utility function that matches that. But I can't tell you what the right utility function is. I can only tell you what the utility function is that matches your worldview. And then from there, I can optimize pretty much any utility function. So I think that's the real value in math, is it's not that it gives a right answer. It's that it gives a person a quantitative interpretation of their own beliefs that they can then make a decision based on. And I'm probably preaching now because I tend to do that when I talk about math.
Okay, so let's bring it back. You can't use math to figure out what's worth doing, but you can start with your worldview and what kinds of outcomes you want to optimize for, and some of your assumptions about how things work. So if you're somebody building a project, like a founder or a member of a team, what kinds of, in the context of Web3, where you've got liquidity, let's just stick with DeFi, for example. What are some of the actors that we'd want to include in our model, and what kinds of assumptions might we make about each one, just to begin to build out this common vocabulary of modeling DeFi games?
So the key, or one of the keys, is to determine what the incentives of the actors are, and that determines the type of actions they're likely to take. So let's imagine, for instance, that you're building a network, and you're building a DAO, and you're bringing people on board. Well, how much does it cost to really train them well versus just throwing them to the wolves? And then how much payoff do you get for that? How much better are they off if you spend 2 weeks having them do some formal training? They may be ready to jump right in. What's the long-term benefit of that? I can't, I don't know. But if you tell me what you think it is, then we can look at the consequences long-term of what's your return on investment for that. Right. So that's one example. When you have DAO members and DAO contributors, if they engage in discussion versus just solving the problem immediately, there's a cost there. You could get the problem solved immediately, but maybe you lose something in teamwork or in knowledge that could be shared. So those are some examples of trade-offs. Those come from, this is public, but I used to work with Gitcoin as a subject matter expert. and we were looking at Sybil resistance, and we were trying to model when you're bringing in people to detect Sybils, like how much is it worth doing training, how much is it worth engaging in discussion. The model's public, and that's something that would be worth considering. That's just one example. It's really difficult to predict the USD value of tokens, right? So that's the market is if I had a market, if I had a model for the market, I wouldn't be talking to you. I'd just be sitting somewhere watching the money roll in. But we can make reasonable assumptions and we can analyze different scenarios that could occur.
Yeah. And one thing, Andrew, that you and I talked about was the objective function, right? So kind of like when you start thinking about what does your project intend to, your objective function is in some way the embodiment of like the worldview of what you want that the project to be, right? What do you want to optimize for? And then adding some of the constraints around, well, I should not, I don't know, cheat people out of their money, right? Could be one of the constraints for like, you know, maximizing X, right, in your project. I think that to me, when we had that conversation, that was very eye-opening in terms of, you know, what do you do first, right? As you start thinking about how to build a model, I think that you know, high-level objective constraints that you want to place on your project, on your actors, I think that's a really good starting point.
Well, and not just your objective function, but the objective functions of all the players, right? So if you're inviting people or entities whose objective function is short-term profit, you can satisfy them with a Ponzi scheme really easily. But then you're attracting people who, it's not sustainable. And even if you're not doing a Ponzi scheme, if you're just attracting people whose primary motivation is to nothing but return on liquidity, then the second a competitor comes along with a higher APY, they're going to be gone. So it's not just the objective function of you, it's the objective function of all the other players that you might be cooperating with or competing against as well.
Does that help, Derek, the initial question?
It does. I think it's interesting that we've now brought in two what I see as pretty different ways that somebody contribute to a project. You started with the example of DAOs and weighing the trade-offs of time spent training and onboarding somebody to the amount they can meaningfully contribute. And so this is kind of like an input output, but at the human layer. And then we've also brought in just at the financial layer, like depending on how you structure token emissions, what kind of liquidity is going to flow in and when is it going to leave. How do you begin to bridge these, begin to have a conversation about token emissions? A lot of DAOs have emissions in the form of incentivized liquidity, or a lot of projects do rather, and then a lot of DAOs more specifically do like a static treasury management and are playing this game of the proposal system and the smaller working groups, trying to coordinate at a more social layer to grab the bag in what people would try to set up as a balanced incentive system. So can we add a little more nuance to the social layer? Because I think if you notice any trends, if you notice any framework that could help us begin to grasp at what we're seeing over and over and over again, which is we're intentionally reinventing the wheel for how humans coordinate with each other and make decisions about what our priorities are, what kinds of initiatives can help us move toward those priorities, and how should we assign value to accomplishing those initiatives and pay or like allocate tokens to people along the way. So that's the DAO space, the social space where people are getting, from my view, wrapped around the axle of like, well, how many tokens is me spending 5 hours spinning up a front end or creating a Discord bot worth? Which is a very difficult question to answer. So do you see anything there that could help us look at it through a simpler lens?
I think it's about resource allocation. All of these problems are about resource allocation. Are you going to spend time on training? Are you going to put money in this project? And in all honesty, there are a lot of new ideas in this space, but there are also a lot of things that have been explored where you could look at, analogous models that already have been studied and explored and are known, like the Kelly model, that was known since the early 1950s. So if you're looking for risk in that particular situation, so it's there's a lot of it that is the art of recognizing when you're in a situation where a known model already applies. Because at the end of the day, there are only so many different ways that agents can interact, and they're going to fall into certain patterns. You can't it's unlikely that you can create a completely new situation or a completely new model that has no antecedents and has a high probability of being effective.
Um, I would count myself among the many people who are not well versed in like this literature or this kind of modeling. Are there some either resources or particular like terms or frameworks that somebody might want to take a look at? Maybe like a book or a course or just like a set of knowledge that somebody could dig into to better understand some of these more basic models?
Yeah, I think one thing to look at. So Michael Zargum and some of his collaborators at Blockscience have done a lot of work in connecting cybernetics to DAOs. And so cybernetics is just, the structure of networks and information flow through networks. And there's actually a paper that they have called Aligning DAOs to Precedents in Cybernetics, which is Michael Zargum and Kelsey Nabin. And that's a really great paper. My personal favorite, there's another one called Thinking in Systems by Danella Meadows. And here you have there's a list of system archetypes, including the tragedy of the commons, the rich get richer. And so if you're actually looking at how your components are interacting, you may be able to say, oh, wait a minute, this is, moving the goal, which is something you can recognize because moving the goal looks the same no matter what the system is. I'm going to put my personal plug in here, which is a book called, I feel embarrassed. I can't remember if it's Two Cheers or Three Cheers. So let me look that up real quick. It's Two Cheers for Anarchism by James C. Scott. And I think that if you're running a DAO, it's important to understand the history of anarchism as an effective practice because there's a command and control model of disseminating information, but there have been very effective and well-studied work that is not about command and control. It is about decentralization. I mean, decentralization is not a new idea. People have thought about best practices for decentralization. People have built decentralized organizations, going back at least 100 years. And so just looking at the spectrum of things, if you try to take a DAO, which is supposed to be a decentralized organization, and then you immediately try to paste the corporation on top of it, it's not going to work. They're fundamentally different models. So starting with looking at functional decentralized organizations and the fact that these have a long precedent is important even before we get to any mathematical or structural modeling. Rodolfo, what would you recommend?
I'm blanking out on the name of this book. Hold on, I'll find it. So yeah, thinking in systems. I think anything related to systems thinking, I think, is a really good way of getting introduced to just the general idea that everything is connected to each other. Everything has feedback loops, right? And those feedback loops can compound or balance, right? Specific effects. So yeah, I think thinking in systems. There's let me see. I have it right here. It's called Business Dynamics. It's an MIT professor, Sturman. I'm blanking out on his first name. And then I'm thinking about the book. What's the one where they describe the Teal organization? That's the one that I'm totally blanking on the name of it. I'll find it. but that's another one that I think is pretty interesting in terms of just analyzing the different types of organizational structures that have been tried, and ending in teal organizations, which I believe Silo uh, it has or had that framework, and even I think Zappos also followed that. Uh,
And there's no right way or right answer, right? You may decide that the right structure for you is that you're going to draft employees and give them orders and use the threat of force to keep them from leaving. I wouldn't recommend that, but it's a model that's worked at different times in the past. I think what's most important, more than like me or anyone else trying to prescribe a structure, is that you, whoever's doing the founding, be really clear about what their structure is and where that comes from and what it connects to. So you see a lot of anarchism by accident, where people like just wind up with an anarchist structure, but it's because they didn't think about it carefully. That doesn't work. There's an excellent essay, which is another thing I can recommend, which is The Tyranny of Structurelessness. And basically it says no matter what you're doing, you end up with a structure. It's by Joe Freeman. No matter what you're doing, you end up with a structure. So what's important is that the structure be intentionally designed and explicitly communicated so that people have the opportunity to really engage with it in the way that's intended. Because otherwise, the structure can be directed or exploited in sort of a hidden way. When a lot of DAOs are rediscovering is that they've kind of reinvented this tyranny of structurelessness just because they didn't have a clear structure going in.
yeah, I found the book. It's called Reinventing Organizations. Sorry to add it at the last minute. Um, but yeah, and then one of the questions that I think comes up frequently is, as you think about all these, big picture problems, kind of like when is the right time if you're starting a project, or you're, for a little bit further down the road, when do you actually spend time really thinking more deeply about building models, right, to formalize the thinking, the worldview that we talked about, right? And yeah, I think that's a, there's no there's no like specific answer, right? But here it is. Here's the magic formula of when. But we've talked about that, and Andrew has been working with a number of clients doing this type of work, and there are some guardrails that I think we found. So one of them is, if you're a DeFi product, you should be doing that on day zero, basically, because the product and the model are the same thing, right? So there's no time to waste, right, in terms of really trying to formalize your thinking. And then at the other extreme, right, if you're something like a like for example, like NBA Top Shot, which is an awesome project. I really like it, right? But it doesn't require it to really engage actors to perform work or to really interact in a fashion that's different than just buying and, I sell you some, buying and selling a product, right? So for that, at that other end of the spectrum, you probably don't need necessarily to do a lot of this more in-depth modeling, because you really, I mean, you don't even have, a token, right, in that sense. And then in between, right, it really depends what type of project you're in, your stage, if it's like an idea versus like a pre-seed or a Series A, so on and so forth. But generally, again, this is more like rule of thumb. If you are getting into a Series A, and you have a the topology of your network is one where you have different types of actors interacting with your project, it's probably a very good idea to dig into this, right at that, edge of Series A. Again, it's not a hard science, right? This is more empirical and observations that, yeah, we've had. But that's again, that's a question that comes up frequently. Is like, do I even need to worry about this, right? It's hard enough building a product. Now, do I really need to start thinking about all these crazy like actors that I want to start engaging with, so on and so forth? And yeah, that was our attempt at providing some sort of guidance in terms of how to think about that, the timing of
Yeah, I'm seeing this as maybe two sides of one conversation where on the one hand we've been talking about how to structure rewards and incentives for certain actions and when it makes sense to do that and what benefits there would be. And then on the other side, at this human coordination layer I keep coming back to,
it.
I appreciated a moment ago, Andrew, when you said that it doesn't make sense to be a DAO in name only, a dino, as we often say, and then have this command and conquer structure from day one. There's going to be like a tension between those two. And so what came up for me is this idea of progressive decentralization, which is a term that gets thrown around a lot. And just in our simple definition is like some kind of a project starts with a couple core team members that have an idea, build it out, and it gets some sea legs, whether that's TVL or users or whatever. And then there comes this chasm they try to cross, especially in Web3, where we're trying to incentivize people to not just be like customers of our platform, but users and even like co-governors ultimately through the governance token and so on. Somebody's going to have to build the how we coordinate so that other people can show up and play in whatever sandbox has been built. So in this toy model of going from the dictatorship of a small number of core team members, it could be one, it could be four, or whatever, to some kind of clear set of rules and structures and processes for anyone, we love this word, permissionlessly, to show up and participate. That feels also like the answer to your question in terms of timing. If you want people to know what to do, how to help, how to get your token in a like contribute time kind of way rather than just in a contribute liquidity kind of way, that's where you have that conversation. Like, what's our model? What do we value? How do we want to incentivize it?
Mm-hmm.
So I can see it beginning to answer, two sides, which are like, do I even need to think about tokenomics? Well, yeah, if you're going to be throwing a token around. In the same way a lot of DeFi projects carelessly have really high APYs just for the sake of it to get people's eyeballs, a lot of small DAOs or communities are like, well, let's spin up an ERC20 and ta-da, we've got a treasury, and let's just start moving fast and breaking things and figuring it out iteratively from the ground up. And then they end up at certain kinds of roadblocks, I'm sure, some consistent patterns of like, well, you got 10,000 for that on day one, and I'm new here, so do I get 10,000? Do you have seniority? And then, I don't know.
Yeah. We talked to, we won't mention names, but we've heard of a DAO that had to relaunch its token 3 times because they figured out along the kind of like the move fast break things, right? That that didn't quite work, and this creating some weird dynamics here. And it's not only that, that's really detrimental to the community because you're confusing the heck out of everyone. It's also an organizational nightmare to actually, so who had tokens in the first one? And now we need to translate those tokens to this one. But to your point, like, is there a seniority or whatnot, right? So again, if you do that multiple times and your model basically is throwing something out, seeing what happens, and then trying to fix it as you go along, right? That works well in Web 2, right, for a number of reasons. But especially when it comes to incentives and when it comes to engaging people that you're not necessarily paying directly to engage with you, that fabric is much more it breaks much more easily. So therefore the thoughtfulness that needs to go into that is the bar is higher, right? Than just let's just put a blue button, and if people don't like it, we'll turn it into a red button. No harm, no foul, right? This is different.
Part of that too is there's a consistent risk pattern, I think, is the gatekeeping of expertise. So when an organization releases a white paper, are they releasing the white paper expecting that the majority of their users will actually read it? Or are they releasing it trying to impress people with how, much math notation they can put on their ideas? It's kind of like what we had with the Kelly criterion, right? Like, for some people, seeing that formula will immediately be like, oh, that's what the answer is. But for lots of other people, having the chance to interact with it and try the numbers and click the buttons, so you can like move fast and break things, but in a safe way because you're doing it on the computer instead of in reality. You can play the game where no actual money is on the line. So one of the things we're working on that I'm really excited about is called Smart Papers, which is adding interactivity to white papers. And Chris Frazier has recently given a talk about like the vision for the Smart Paper. And I think if people lean into this, it would really be a big deal, because your solution can be as technically correct as you want it to be. But if you cannot communicate it effectively to the majority of your community, that's a real problem. And so sometimes like the right math answer, there's so much communication complexity with it that it turns out not to be optimal, because you need people on board, right? You need people to understand what you're saying, and there's just that gap. So I wanted to put in a plug for making things visual and interactive as much as we can, so that we're not just like, oh, there was this paper from 1950, but that people actually have a chance to experience it and feel the ideas for themselves. I think that's going to be a big thing for everybody in Web3 moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
I appreciate that. Rod, do you have any other sort of like, if you could add one thing or change one thing that you think would improve the way we either communicate or go about making these kinds of decisions? Do you see something you wish were different?
Yeah, I'm going to piggyback a little bit on what Andrew said, because I think that we in Web3 we talk a lot about decentralized governance, right? And there's this idea that everyone that is part of the membership will vote on X, right? And everyone has the same level of knowledge, right? So I think that what the smart papers potentially do, right, is not only clarify the white paper, but more importantly, when really big important decisions are coming along, right? And I actually have to vote, but I don't have the math expertise or what have you. But if you give me a few dials to play with so that I can get better informed, right, about how to vote, right, I think that would be something that could be hugely valuable, because right now, the fact that people can vote, right, if they don't know enough on how to vote, then it's kind of like it's a centralization point, right? Because only a very small number of people actually know what the heck is going on. So the majority of people would just like, I don't know, I'll just like step back and let the experts kind of like figure it out, right? So I think that if we could do that in Web3, I think that'd be incredibly helpful and truly make it a more democratic process at the real level, not at the theoretical, hypothetical, one person or one token, one vote, right?
Yeah, I agree. Huge shout outs to data visualization as a field that, at the practical level, I have a few friends beginning to learn some of the skills, learn like D3.js, for example, and we're moving really fast in what we can build and how we can show things and make them like really deeply engaging beyond like, I think we're at like 3 tiers. We're at no graph, no visuals is very common. And then you have like bad graphs, like for example, something that's a pie chart. I think pie charts have almost no useful use cases in my like just general life experience. Anything that's a pie chart would be better served as a bar chart if you're trying to like compare relative amounts or something. I don't know, like don't show me that it's 16% over at like the 7 o'clock position. That's not intuitive for me. Just show me a bar that's like a third as tall as the other bar. But then you have this giant jump up to like compelling things like Beam Me Up Now is saying on the Rocket Pool pages. This creates engagement, which deepens onboarding and stickiness and education, like you said, Rod, a moment ago, and gets people from that place of I'm brand new here to, oh, I have some buy-in, I'm interested, and then I can actually participate. Like you were saying a moment ago, Andrew, if your game theory assumes people are going to participate, you should do the work to make you get closer to that reality instead of just assuming if you build it, they will come. So by way of a somewhat abrupt transition to a close here, I was wondering, gentlemen, if either of you wanted to share a last thought, or maybe if folks are interested in following up with you about anything you've shared today, how you prefer to be reached.
Yeah. So I think, as Andrew mentioned, we're both collaborators with Blockscience Labs. So I believe the email for that, or the Twitter handle is at BSCI Labs, and the email. Hold on, let me grab that. It is contact@blocksciencelabs.com, and yeah, we can provide more information via that. We're also part of this group, really, that's more I think research/fandom group called Token Gnomes, where we are discussing very specific work that different members are doing, and this is like pre-paper, pre-presentation. It's kind of like a forum for people that are really interested in these types of topics to basically show up, have a community that supports them, provide feedback, and educate, right? Exchange ideas. So we are in the process of building that, a website for that. But yeah, if anyone is interested in that, probably you can also use those channels to find out more about that. Andrew, I don't know if any other connection point for you.
Yeah, I love thinking about new problems. So if people want to throw things at me to think about, the best way is to get in contact with Blockscience Labs, and I'm doing the consulting work for them. I also want to mention I've been a university professor for 7.5 years, but I'm leaving. I'm leaving a tenured position because I want to be in a decentralized world and to have freedom, more intellectual freedom. So I'm doing my teaching work right now through a Token Engineering Academy, and there are lots of courses there people can sign up for that might be interesting to people who want to learn more about the actual math and simulation skills. So for people who want models built, contact us at Blockscience Labs. And for people who are building models, get in touch with Token Gnomes. And for people who want to learn how to build models, Token Engineering Academy. It kind of like got 3 different levels of engagement.
Thank you both so much. I did not expect us to go this far and have it feel comprehensive, like we've filled in all the gaps in between the pieces, despite how much ground we've covered. So thank you both again for your time. I look forward to hopefully the next time we get to have one of these convers.
It was
Great.
great.
Thanks, Eric.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Have a great rest of your day.
Bye-bye.